Welcome back to Wordsmiths and a Wolfhound, Happiness Through the Arts and Self-Sufficiency. Tonight we have a fun project that we have been working on, preparing for, I think about February or so. And it is all this fun equipment right here on the table. What, you may ask, is this, Chris?
Welcome to Wordsmiths and a Wolfhound. You know, maple trees don't necessarily need to have all the fun. We happen to have a tremendous number of birch trees on our property, so we thought we would get ready to start taking advantage of producing some birch syrup and sap in order to find out what we can do with it. And we know we have some things such as birch beer soda or birch tea that you can make. And in actuality, an interesting aspect of birch is that it happens to share an essential oil with wintergreen. And as a matter of fact, most wintergreen that is produced for flavoring in this country actually comes from birch sap. And so sometimes birch syrup is actually flavored with a couple of birch branches in order to produce kind of a wintergreen, a little bit of a tang to the birch syrup. And so we thought we would show you some equipment, which happens to be very much in common with maple tapping equipment, but the process and the timing is a little bit different.
So show us some of these parts. We got the kit, 3-4 weeks ago already, but we have really only just started to open it up and look at what we have.
And pretty much it's very simple, and like I said, very much in common with maple. So you have some tubes which are used to convey the syrup from the spiles into what amounts to a food grade bucket. And you've got a drill bit. This is a 5/16 inch drill bit. They used to use 7/16 inch drills because they thought they could get more syrup out of it, but the problem with that was that it produced wounds in the trees that didn't heal as well. So 5/16 will heal very readily and produce just as much syrup as you need. These spiles are the same that are used for maple tapping. The tube attaches to this end over here, and this spile goes in just about 1.5 inches into the tree. So you're below the bark, you're below the phloem, you're below the cambrium, you're into the sapwood, but not all the way to the hardwood of the tree. And this is where the sap flows best. And out of that, you will get approximately 1 quart to 1 gallon per flow period. And a flow period could be approximately every several hours to upwards of a day. And then out of these, apart from these spiles, you happen to have something that looks like an enormous coffee filter. And that's essentially what it is. The idea here is that you're filtering off sugar sand, any sawdust or anything that might come from within the tree that doesn't belong in your syrup. Other than that, the only thing you really need is a food grade bucket or a bag. The thing with birch syrup, in contrast to maple syrup, it's a little more acidic. So there are many metal buckets that you wouldn't want to use. If you did use metal, a stainless steel bucket would be good. But basically food grade buckets, which are like these plastic buckets with tops on them, you can stick the tube through the top of the bucket, keep the rainwater out, and you'll do fine.
Very interesting. And have you ever done this before?
I have done this as a scout. I actually chopped up some birch saplings for birch tea, and then also learned how to tap trees then in order to produce some syrup. But I have not done this on a suitable scale, to actually produce, good birch syrup out of the process.
So tell me a little bit about putting, what did you call them that you actually put into
spiles?
the tree?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How do you go about putting those in? Is it fairly easy to just push it in, or do you need to pound it in a little bit?
So it can be a little both, right? So the idea is that you take your drill bit, you drill only in as far as you need to for the spile, you drill up into the tree, and then you might need a little bit of a mallet or hammer in order to finish pushing it in. There's a lot of pressure that's the tree is producing, and so even after just producing the hole with the drill bit, it can start to try to close up a little on you, which might need the mallet. You're looking for birch trees that are about 10 inches in diameter or greater, and you're also looking for trees that have a very nice canopy on them and no dead branches. If they start to have dead branches and things like that, the quality of the syrup is going to start to go down pretty significantly.
No, so you first push the drill bit into the tree to make the hole. And here's Leodin to see what she has to offer. I'm sure she's looking forward to trying some of this. You first drill into the tree just a little bit, and then you put in the spile.
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
And then you attach the tube and run that to your bucket. And now the interesting thing about birches is in maples, you are actually tapping in about the February to March time frame up here in the north. That's when the syrup runs fastest. For birch trees, the actual time that you're tapping trees is late March or into April. Temperatures during the day are getting into the 40s and 50s. They may still get to freezing at night, but the key is that the sap flows best when you get to the 40s or 50s. The challenge with that is by virtue of the higher temperature, the syrup or the sap can spoil faster. And so you need to process it more quickly than you might with maple syrup.
So how often do you expect to be emptying these buckets? Pretty much daily, or is it going to be more weekly?
It depends on the tree. By virtue of the fact that you're doing in warmer temperatures, you're going to be wanting to empty these buckets no less than daily. Making sure that as the sap flows, you may actually be able to empty it more frequently than that.
And how many trees do you expect that we will be tapping for our purposes? Now, keeping in mind that it's going to take about 100 gallons of sap to get 1 gallon of syrup.
Yes, a tree will produce between a quart and a gallon per flow period, which can be several hours to a day. And so in order to get that 100 to 1, which is different than a maple tree is about 30 or 40 to 1, you're going to need to tap a fair number of trees and pull a fair amount of sap and process it. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to pull a full 100 gallons in order to get the 1 gallon. If you pulled 50 gallons, you're going to get a half gallon of syrup out of it, and so that might be enough for you to start with. If you think about it, a half gallon of syrup is a fair amount of sugar syrup in order to start having some fun with in recipes and things like that.
So what are the main differences between maple and birch as far as tapping trees? And can other trees also be tapped for syrup?
Right. So the main difference between maple syrup and birch syrup is that maple is certainly sweeter, right? We put that on pancakes. We might put it on ice cream and things like that. With birch syrup, it's not necessarily a sweeter syrup. It is definitely got a bit more of a tang to it, or even some, like I said earlier, a bit with the wintergreen. So you might want to put this on meats or veggies or things like that, where it's a bit more of a savory syrup than it is a sweet syrup. You also brought up other trees, and yes, you can certainly tap other trees, certainly different kinds of maple and birch, but you can also tap walnut trees as an example and get some very, very good syrup out of that, especially for pancakes, candies, or ice cream and things like that as well.
So if people wanted to tap different trees, is this like plants where you have different growing zones? So for instance, is somebody living in a different zone going to tap at a different time?
Could very well be. So for example, out west, you can actually tap maple trees pretty much year-round. They don't necessarily see some of those deep freezing cycles, and so you might be able to get some decent syrup out of them, even across the year. Here in the North Country in Minnesota, we definitely would want to tap in the springtime, and there is an end to it. You want to be able to get all of your sap out before the trees bud. By the time they're budding, it's going to take the sap, and the syrup is going to taste a lot more green or grassy, if you will, which is not really a good flavor characteristic, as the tree actually starts to produce the sap on behalf of growing leaves. What we're basically exploiting here is photosynthesis in the trees, that between carbon dioxide and sunlight and water and a few minerals, the tree produces this wonderful sugar. And we want to take advantage of the sugar in order to be able to produce the syrup that we need for recipes and things like that.
So if people are interested in starting to do some of their own tapping of either maple or birch trees, where would they find a kit like this?
Well, we happen to find this online, and Amazon or other places certainly have a lot of this. There's a number of aspects here, that are basically very similar for tapping all the different types of trees. One of the things you want to pay attention to, though, is at the end of the process, when you actually have a bunch of sap, what do you do with it? And the basic idea is you need to eliminate the water from it so you can get that syrup, down into something that you can use. With maple syrup, you're pretty much boiling it at about 219 degrees Fahrenheit until all the water is driven off. If you did that with birch sap, you would actually burn the sap fairly quickly. And so you don't actually boil birch sap so much as you just cook it at a decent high temperature. And that temperature is about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So you eliminate about half the water at 200 degrees through some boiling, just a simmering of it. And then you can actually use a crock pot in order to take the remaining sap and continue to drive off the water until you get it down to a Brix rating of about 57 to 60 or so, which is when you're getting actually that good, decent, sweet birch taste that you're looking for.
So when people buy this kit, they'll still need to buy a few other things such as the buckets, perhaps extra tubes, because my understanding is that you can actually connect these tubes between trees.
Yes, you can get a spile, for example, that actually has multiple tube taps on it. So you can connect the tubes together and actually drive the sap down into maybe a larger bucket. Some people have some fairly significantly sized buckets that are, a few feet around and things like that. If they're tapping dozens or hundreds of trees, it helps you, bring that sap into one place quickly so that you can then transfer it to the evaporator system or cooking system that you may have.
And in addition to the kit that we have here and the buckets, they would also need to buy the equipment to boil this down, or is this more of a simple stovetop process? I'm guessing not with 100 gallons.
Right, that's the thing. The basic, but you're also processing it as you're moving along, right? Mm-hmm. So as you're gathering the sap, it's not like, especially with birch sap, which can spoil in the higher temperatures, it's not like you're waiting to process this stuff. You want to boil it down and evaporate it down as fast as you can. And it's kind of the same with maple as well. As soon as you're gathering it, you're boiling it and getting it processed to the extent that you need it. So, the basic point is that, for birch, of course, you can use a stovetop because you're not so much boiling as you are just simmering the water off. And like I said, even a crock pot then, by the time you're about 50% reduced in volume, you can start to continue to evaporate that water. With maple, it's more of a full, vigorous boil. And you could do it over an open fire with a large evaporator pan, and then, gather off the syrup as time goes on. But it just depends upon the extent of your operation and how much syrup you really want to produce.
Fantastic. So we have quite the chore ahead of us. Starting in, you said about February, we'll start tapping the birch trees.
Actually, February is for maple trees. Okay. More into April is when we'll tap the birch trees around the property. The last thing I'll say is with respect to how do you take care of this equipment once you're done with it. Well, the idea is any thing that you may use that has any kind of a scent in it will impart a flavor to your syrup. So you really don't want to use any kind of soap or anything that may leave a residue within the tubes or the spiles or anything like that, or your buckets. Really, a 20-to-1 solution of water to bleach is enough. You rinse with hot water all of the sap out, and then you rinse it again with the bleach water, and that's enough to clean it. Some people will reuse the filters that they have, but in reality, these things are cheap enough that you can continue to get more of them without a major expense.
I did have one last question, and that is, how do you prevent the deer from just, licking away at our sap? That's supposed to be our syrup and not theirs.
Yes. So, part of it is to make it a bit more inaccessible to them. Or put it into things that they wouldn't necessarily consider to be food worthy. So some of the sap bags that you see will store the sap without necessarily enabling it to smell like anything. And then also the food grade buckets as well, where you actually snap the plastic lids onto the rim, and they might be able to push around the bucket a bit, but it's not going to be fundamentally causing a problem. In reality, something that is from within a tree like that would not be central or even ancillary to the diet of an animal like a deer, so they wouldn't necessarily be attracted to it. They would be attracted more in the springtime to browsing on branches, any remaining dried fruit from the winter and things like that. And so that would be most of the time that they're spending trying to find food to eat.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to this project, and we will have more of the winter to really study up, and we'll be sharing more of that with you. And I believe our next video we will be talking about how to bake bread from scratch.
Yes, indeed.
Which I'm sure plenty of people out there know how to do, but I think it's kind of a lost skill for most of us. I've almost never baked bread, so that should be fun.
Yes, you take a little bit of flour, a little bit of yeast, a little bit of salt and water, and essentially you can start to make some wonderful bread. Maybe a slight little egg white wash on top, and you're done.
We will see you next time on Wordsmiths and a Wolfhound.